de inauguración del Congreso Internacional EVALtrends2020, que como saben ustedes, como sabéis vosotros, se celebra durante estos 3 días en Cádiz. Tenemos el placer, la suerte de poder contar con vosotros, con vuestra asistencia, para tratar un tema tan importante para todas nuestras universidades como es el aprendizaje en educación superior. En primer lugar, le voy a dar la palabra a la chair, a la organizadora, a la presidenta del comité organizador, que es la profesora María Soledad Ibarra. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, vicerrectora. Bueno, pues yo también. Mi primera tarea en estas sesiones es daros la bienvenida. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos todos a este congreso. Como sabéis, hace 9 años hicimos la primera edición de EVALtrends y en ese momento pues la meta estaba, o había un documento tremendamente importante que nos ha estado guiando, que era el Assessment 2020. Bueno, pues ya estamos en el Assessment 2020, ya estamos en el 2020 y en esta reunión se trata de que seamos capaces de ver a dónde ha llegado o a dónde hemos sido capaces de llegar con la evaluación y fundamentalmente las metas y retos que en evaluación en educación superior nos podemos proponer y podemos tener en cuenta. Pero no solamente para nuestro contexto más inmediato, como puede ser la investigación o como puede ser la innovación o como puede ser la docencia, ¿no?, sino en un contexto bastante más amplio que afecte a las instituciones de educación superior en general y que afecte también a todas esas agencias de acreditación y de evaluación y de calidad que tienen que ver y están diciendo mucho en evaluación. No os voy a hacer una presentación del programa porque ya todos estáis aquí, lo habéis visto, pero sí que quiero agradecer a los 2 ponentes principales que van a estar con nosotros. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jan. Muchas gracias a los participantes en la mesa redonda, Gregorio, Elena, Carmen y Víctor, por participar también en esta mesa redonda. Y, sobre todo, o por lo menos al mismo nivel también, muchas gracias a todos los que vais a participar contribuyendo, es decir, comunicando. Como sabéis, este congreso no es un congreso al uso. Aquí no se trata de venir y preparar una presentación y me voy, o me voy y me cambio de sala, sino que estamos todos ya agrupados por talleres. Aquí no podemos hablar más de 3 minutos, yo ya me estoy excediendo, más de 3 minutos con nuestra contribución y lo que se trata fundamentalmente es de fomentar la discusión, el debate, la reflexión, que surjan ideas, que podamos al final tener un pequeño documento con esas ideas, con esas propuestas, con esos retos y que podamos seguir avanzando en este campo tan maravilloso como es la evaluación en educación superior. Muchas gracias a todos vosotros y muchas gracias tanto a la vicerrectora de Política Científica que nos acompaña y muchísimas gracias también a la señora decana de la Facultad de Enfermería y Fisioterapia, María José Avellán, bueno, pues por estar aquí, pero sobre todo también pues, por compartir esta cultura científica y por no habernos cedido su centro. Muchísimas gracias a los 2.
Muchísimas gracias por tus palabras y doy ahora la palabra a nuestra anfitriona, a la anfitriona que es la decana de la Facultad de Enfermería y de Fisioterapia, la profesora María José Avellán. Gracias.
Bueno, pues buenas tardes, bienvenidos. Agradecer a la organización que haya pensado en esta facultad y además que es histórico porque yo recuerdo hace más de 10 años que ya nos pidieron, en concreto en mi asignatura, el poder hacer actividades de innovación docente en temas tan difíciles como la evaluación, ¿no?, que yo creo que es un reto de todo el profesorado. Entonces, para mí es un placer, que estoy prácticamente recién estrenada como decana, el ver que aquel grupo de trabajo ha evolucionado y ha evolucionado tan bien, ¿no?, y con tanta solvencia. Agradecerles que hayan elegido esta facultad, que ya es tradición que se utilice para eventos científicos de bastante peso, y, por supuesto, a la vicerrectora que haya querido aceptar la invitación y compartir con nosotros esta tarde. Tienen 3 aulas disponibles para ello y al personal de Administración y Servicio a vuestra disposición para cualquier eventualidad que pueda ocurrir. Cualquier necesidad, como la que ha ocurrido hace un momentito, que están para que vosotros pongáis vuestra sabiduría y nosotros el confort para que os sintáis en casa, igual que en Cádiz, ¿no? Bienvenidos a Cádiz, bienvenidos a la Facultad de Enfermería y Fisioterapia y a la Universidad de Cádiz.
Muchas gracias, profesora Avellán. Yo simplemente voy a cerrar el acto, tendré cuidado y seré precavida con esos 3 minutos, ¿no?
No te puedes más.
No quiero tampoco pasarme en el tiempo. Bueno, deciros que para la Universidad de Cádiz es un honor contar con grupos de investigación con la amplia trayectoria que tiene el grupo que lidera la profesora Ibarra y el profesor Gregorio Rodríguez y el resto de componentes y miembros de este equipo, con tanta experiencia, tanta capacidad y tanto trabajo en un tema tan significativo para las universidades, en el que hoy estoy en un congreso muy diferente a los temas, a los tópicos en los que yo normalmente participo, pero que une los 2 grandes retos de una universidad, que son la docencia y la investigación, precisamente investigando sobre el aprendizaje, investigando sobre la evaluación. Entonces, me parece extraordinario. Quiero también agradecerles a ellos, además de traernos a Cádiz este congreso, también la posibilidad de haber conseguido esa cátedra UNESCO de evaluación, innovación y excelencia en educación, que está dando sus primeros pasos, liderada por la profesora Marisol Ibarra, y que esperamos que nos dé muchas alegrías, estoy segura, que cuente, se lo acabo de decir en privado y luego ahora en público, con el total apoyo del Vicerrectorado de Política Científica y Tecnológica, y que creo y entiendo que va a ser una gran oportunidad para la Universidad de Cádiz en general, pues para todos vosotros que os dedicáis a la investigación y el aprendizaje, sobre el aprendizaje y en concreto, en este caso, sobre las prácticas de evaluación. Estaba leyendo, un poquito, haciendo ayer una chuleta para acercarme a vosotros y saber en lo que trabajáis, en lo que hacéis. Leía en la página web y ahora me lo ratificaba Marisol, que realmente todo este trabajo se inicia en un documento, el Assessment 2020, que surge en un congreso también celebrado aquí en Cádiz, en el que participan además y son artífices y pioneros los ponentes principales, los conferenciantes, a los que también agradezco su presencia y todo lo que nos van a contar y participar en este congreso, es decir, al profesor Boud y a la profesora MacArthur. Deciros que es una doble alegría que haya surgido ese documento, el Assessment 2020 en Cádiz, y que además sus conclusiones, la discusión de los resultados que se han obtenido, precisamente se vuelvan a conocer y a discutir en nuestra universidad. Me parece, como ya decía antes, que es muy importante, es extraordinario el tema. Estamos en un camino y un escenario en el que tenemos que trabajar y conocer, identificar cuáles son las políticas de acreditación de nuestros títulos, un escenario cambiante en el que puede haber muchas modificaciones en los próximos años y que todo esto, como muchas veces nos ocurre en las ciencias experimentales de las que yo provengo, parece que las ciencias experimentales, esas de laboratorio, la nanotecnología, los materiales avanzados, necesitan mucha experimentación y es verdad, así es, muchas horas de laboratorio, dedicamos mucho esfuerzo, pero no somos los únicos, sino en otros temas, como en este caso, no se puede trabajar con los estudiantes, no se puede evaluar sin hacer también una investigación previa, en la que realmente el reto me parece increíble, que sean los propios estudiantes los que participen en su evaluación, los que aprendan con la evaluación, me imagino que la suya propia, la de su entorno, la de sus compañeros. El reto, desde luego, es complicado e increíble y sé que vais a hablar estos días, en estos talleres, durante estos 3 días, de todos estos temas. Espero que las conclusiones sean fructíferas y diría, y si fuera un congreso de otro tipo, diría por el bien de la ciencia, por el bien de la investigación científica, en este caso, es mucho más cercano y hasta podríamos decir que incluso más útil por el bien de la docencia de la formación de nuestros docentes y también por el aprendizaje de nuestros estudiantes. Entonces, deciros que aprovechéis, lo sé que lo vais a hacer muy bien, todos estos talleres, esta magnífica organización y, como no, también que disfrutéis, si os lo permite la organización y el poco tiempo que seguro que queda disponibles, del clima primaveral que tenemos ahora mismo en la ciudad de Cádiz, como no, de la cultura del carnaval, de la cultura culinaria, de esa ciudad milenaria que nos acompaña y nos acoge. Y eso, muchísimas gracias de nuevo a los organizadores y a todos los que estáis aquí. Y os deseo unas jornadas muy fructíferas en todos los aspectos, en el aspecto docente, investigador, pero también que disfrutéis de la ciudad. Muchas gracias. Y con esto damos por inaugurada el Congreso EVALtrends2020. Ánimo y adelante. Muchas gracias.
Nicolás, por favor, ¿está preparada la presentación? ¿Sí? ¿La puedes abrir, por favor? Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the International Congress EVALtrends2020. It's a pleasure to me to introduce my colleague and I can say my friend, David. He is, at this moment, he is the director of the Center for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University. Emeritus professor at the University of Technology in Sydney. He is also a professor of work and learning at Middlesex University in London. He has written several publications on teaching, learning, and assessment in higher and professional education. His current work focuses on the areas of assessment for learning in higher education, academic formation, and learning in the workplace. For us, he's a leader in this topic. He is one of the most highly cited scholars worldwide in the fields of higher education. He has been a pioneer in the development and learning center approaches to assessment across the disciplines, focus on learning, especially in building assessment skills for the long-term learning and designing new approaches to feedback. He has published a lot of books and articles, and at this moment I recommend you two translations to Spanish. You can find in this exposition near to here. The book the last book that was translated was Feedback in Higher and Professional Education in 2018. At this moment, we are expecting, because we hope to be illuminated by your keynotes about new challenges for reforming assessment. We hope to illuminate the next 10 years. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Gregorio. I just want to check to see, yes, this is working wherever I move. That's good. I'm very pleased to be back in Cádiz, and I'm very pleased to be here during this wonderful time of the year. You brought the sun out, you brought the entertainment out onto the streets, so this is a very auspicious time to be here. I apologise that I can't address you in Spanish, but I hope the translation works very well. So, as academics and of people associated with the universities, we spend an awful lot of time on this thing called assessment. And also, our students spend a lot of time on it. And by and large, we just take it for granted. Assessment, well, it's just there. It's just what we do. It's an object. It's conventional. But one of the things I want to do in this presentation is to show you that assessment is changing. Assessment is rapidly moving, and it's moving at different rates in different countries and in different disciplines. But it is no longer what we experience as students. Or should I say, hopefully, it is no longer what we experience as students. So what I want to do is to do two things. One is to look back on the last 10 years to see what changes we can see there. And then I want to project forward to look at the kind of changes that we might realistically anticipate, or rather, what I would wish for, with a touch of realism about that. So that's the general shape of what I want to say. So start with a brief comment on the problem of assessment, and then in two parts, one looking back and one looking forward. And hopefully the one looking forward will be more substantial than the looking back. And the thing I want to do looking back is to go back to a document that I was instrumental in creating in Australia. So I was involved just over 10 years ago in a project that looked at assessment in higher education across all the Australian universities. And we brought together representatives from all those universities, both those who had expertise in assessment and those who were decision makers, in order to look forward back then to the next 10 years. So I'm going to draw upon that and see how far we have reached, and then go forward. An important starting point in any discussion of assessment is that assessment makes an impact on students, whether we like it or not, and whether or not it is a positive impact. Assessment communicates to students what we want them to do. More importantly, it communicates to students what we value. So look to your tests, look to your assessment activities, and as far as your students are concerned, they are the most perfect representation of what you really care about. And if you can look at your tests and your examinations and your assignments and say, that's what I really care about, then you probably don't need to change. But most people find a bit of a gap between what they value and what is represented to students. For students, it sets their priorities on what they study, how they study. Assessment overemphasises some things and underemphasises others. It massively overemphasises memorisation and low-level recall of knowledge. It underemphasises working with other people, communication skills, and so on and so forth. It changes how students work during the year. Students' work goes up, when they're anticipating assessment and goes down when they're not anticipating assessment. Is this a good thing? Should students work throughout the whole year? Who knows? And finally, our assessment practices inhibit cooperation and collaboration between students. And one of the things that as universities we criticise most for by employers and by people in society is that we do not produce students that can actually work with other people. They've got a whole lot of knowledge, a whole lot of skills, they can do many technical things, but they're hopeless at working with other people. And a part of that is a function of our assessment practices. Our assessment practices don't value that activity. So, assessment does always make a difference. And the other starting point is, why do we do it? Why do we assess? And it's now become pretty well accepted that there are three main reasons why we assess students. There's the obvious reason, which is the first one, and the obvious reason is to ensure that students have actually done what it claims they've done on their certificate. So it's a process of assurance, and it ensures that learning outcomes have been met. Now, I've been told by Gregorio that learning outcomes are still quite controversial and a sensitive topic in Spain. I think it's a very important part of our discourse, and I will explain that as we go through. But by learning outcomes, all I mean is, are we, in our assessment, assuring that students can do the kind of things we expect them to be able to do? And we call that summative assessment. Secondly, the other second purpose is that it provides students with useful information to aid their learning now. And we call that things like feedback. And we call that formative assessment. And finally, the third important leg of assessment, purpose of assessment, is that it builds students' capacity to judge their own learning. In anticipation of an assessment task, students judge themselves in terms of how well they're doing. Are they ready for it or not? So one of the things that we need to look at assessment from the point of view of is, does assessment help students build the capacities to judge their own learning for themselves? Now that's just by way of a warm-up. So now let's go back 10 years and look at this document. And this document was based upon some very simple ideas. We need to improve assessment because it has a huge impact on how students learn and thus what students achieve. So without assessment, students would do different things and they would end up in a different place. Assessment also involves making judgments about how students' work meets standards. And one of the things that I want to come back to time and time again is assessment and meeting standards. Because we talk about academic standards, we talk about maintaining academic standards, and that means we must have assessment that supports that. And much of the assessment of the past has undermined academic standards. Norm reference testing undermines academic standards systematically, always. And we need to actually root out some of the little pockets of problem that are still there. And also, students need to be able to identify quality work and relate that to their own assignments. How can students produce high quality work if they don't know what it looks like? And in the assessment process, we help them in that journey. So this is the image of the document we produced on your right. And it's very simple. It's only 4 pages, and it is translated into Spanish, so you can go onto our website and find the Spanish version as well as the English version there. And it was a part of this national project. And that national project involved getting assessment experts together. It involved getting high-level people that made decisions about assessment, chairs of academic boards, chairs of assessment committees, people that were associate deans for faculties. And it covered all the Australian universities 10 years ago. And what we were trying to do in that exercise was to reach a consensus, an agreement amongst all those parties about what was needed, what are the key changes needed to support assessment for learning over the next 10 years. And these were not radical statements. We had very, very senior people in the room from various disciplines. And they were not prepared to put their name to a radical document. But I will leave you to judge whether you think this is radical or not. So it basically has 7 propositions, 7 statements. And I'm not going to go into the details of each one, but each one is represented and it's unpacked and is given some detail. But these are the headlines. So the first one is, well, the whole thing is oriented around the idea, when does assessment have most effect? And it has most effect when it is used to engage students in learning that is productive. And memorising a lot of facts is not productive activity. An emphasis on memorisation is very problematic in a world where we carry these things around with us all the time. These are facts in here. This is information. What we need students to be able to do is not memorise what's in here, but know what to do with it. So we need to be very sceptical about assessment that merely tests knowledge. We need, moving forward, to have feedback which actively improves student learning. And I'm going to be talking a bit later about how feedback needs to be organised in order to do that. But feedback is not about justifying grades. It is about providing students with useful information that enables them to change and improve and do things better next time around. We also identified that assessment is most effective when students and teachers become responsible partners in learning and assessment. So the old idea that I teach, you learn, I assess, end of story, doesn't work. We need students to be active partners and active players in learning. I can't learn students. I can teach, but I can't help you learn. So how do we bring these two together? That's another one of the themes. And the final 4 are here. So assessment is most effective when students are inducted into the assessment practices and cultures of higher education. I don't quite know what it's like here, but often there's a big gap between the kind of ways students are assessed in schools and the kind of ways in which they're assessed in universities. And there's a cultural shift that needs to be made in that. Assessment's most important when assessment for learning is placed at the centre of subject and programme design. The old way of doing things was, well, we work out what the syllabus is, we work out what the content is that we need to cover, and then, oh, we need to assess as well. So we just add a few assessment points in as an afterthought. That's not very useful. And in terms of feedback, you then add feedback in on much later again. So we need to think about the whole of our programs around what is it that we want students to be able to do. This is the fundamental organising principle behind the whole curriculum. What is it that students should be able to do after having studied with us? That is what learning outcomes are. They're not a form to be filled in for the satisfaction of administrators. It's a key idea in our own practice. So we need to have focus in staff development on assessment for learning. And finally, we also need to think about how we portray what students do. So typically, when students graduate, they get a certificate and they get a document with a grade point average with a list of grades against subjects they've studied. Nobody in the world outside academia knows what that means. It doesn't communicate anything of any use. It's a strange document that exists within the academy. But of course, our graduates are going out in the world. So how can we actually have things that they can show the world that gives the world some indication of what they can do? So we need to focus on that. So that was 10 years ago. This is not now, going forward. This is 10 years ago, coming to now. How well have you done? See if you can do an assessment of your own progress against these factors. So, my view of the world is actually a very partial one. So I'm very familiar with what goes on in Australia and New Zealand. I'm slightly less familiar with what goes on in the UK and in some of the other English-speaking countries. I'm not so familiar with what goes on in other parts of the world. So what I'll be speaking about now is the changes that I've seen in the parts of the world that I encounter. So I think we can now recognise, most people recognise that assessment has a positive and a negative influence. And we need to take that negative influence very seriously. We've seen, and the literature demonstrates this very clearly, a huge proliferation of activities on peer learning and feedback. So it's been an enormous explosion of writing about peer learning and feedback in the last 10 years. It is now commonplace. It's not radical, it's not innovative, it's normal business in some places. There's been a huge rise of interest in the first year experience and the transition that students make into universities. How do we induct students into the ways of operating and learning within the universities? And there's even been a new word coined for that. It's been called transition pedagogy. You might not like that term, but the fact that there's actually a label attached to it is an indicator that it is a topic of discourse. There's much more focus, much more discussion about active assessment design. Assessment used to be, well, that's what I did when I was a student. That was good enough for me. It's good enough for my students. That's a kind of completely passive view of assessment design. We're now seeing active views of assessment design, which means that what do we need assessment to really do? And let's design it so that it does it. That change has occurred over recent years. The assurance of learning has actually now on the agenda. And it's partly been prompted by external professional bodies. So, for example, most business schools in the world, and this is not a phenomenon in the English-speaking world, most business schools want accreditation from international accrediting agencies. ISSCB is one of the most well-known of these. And what these accrediting agencies want is they want universities to demonstrate that their assessment assures that the university is doing what it says it is doing. Whether it calls it learning outcomes, competencies, whatever the terminology, universities have to demonstrate that they can show that they've done it. And they show they've done it for all students, not a few students, but all students. And finally, training for university teachers is becoming commonplace. It's not a strange thing that, that a few people do. You know, the induction into university teaching is normal. There have been a few other changes in assessment as well that are not to do with that agenda. One's occurred at an institutional level, and I think this is very interesting. And there's been a move away from university assessment policy that focuses on rules towards university assessment policy that focuses on principles. Because the old assessment policies inhibited innovation. They stopped people doing sensible things. People were trapped in the rules for how you conduct an examination. There's a procedure you have to follow, and if you don't follow that procedure, you are not allowed to assess in that way. That's changing rapidly. And the other thing we've seen is the rise of authentic assessment. And I'll say a bit about both of those. So the move from rules-based to principles-based policies is a very interesting one. In a book that a chapter in a book that I produced about 10 years ago or so, I did a little study of the assessment policies in the top 10 Google mentions, both in Australia and the UK. And they were completely dominated, assessment policy then, by rules, details of how you conduct examinations. There's very little about formative assessment, very little about sustainable assessment. And that's started to shift. And one of the reasons it started to shift is litigation. Increasingly, students are willing to take the university to court if they do not have rules, do not have policies that are sensible policies. And most of our old assessment policies are very vulnerable to being knocked down by the courts. Now, you may not have seen a lot of it here, but it is on the rise everywhere. And there's a lot more of it going on than is generally credited, because universities suppress and keep quiet about these challenges by students in the courts. So it's going on, but it's not very well known. And the second thing that has also been going on, excuse me, got a frog that's in my throat here, is the rise of authentic assessment. And what is the problem that authentic assessment seeks to address? It seeks to address the problem that the kind of tasks that we have in assessment in universities do not exist in the world outside. They're there in this strange, closed environment. Writing an essay. How many people in the world out there ever write an essay? What practice, what business involves people writing essays? They write all sorts of documents. They write reports, they write memos, they write letters, they write specifications, they do everything like that, but they do not write essays. Why, in the humanities and social sciences, are we completely dominated by essays? And why, for example, is assessment completely dominated by multiple choice tests in some places? How often in business do people do multiple choice tests? It's an artifact of the world of education. So the challenge that authentic assessment has been designed to address is that what we do in the university has very little relationship between what's important in the world. And the assessment tasks that we set students falsely portray what graduates will do when they leave us. It gives them a false idea. So the aim of authentic assessment is to have assessment tasks that mirror those which occur in the world. And these are some of the features, and they need to be realistic, they need to be contextualised, they work in a context, and they actually solve a problem. So these are some of the features. You can be more or less authentic. So one has to be careful about being too authentic, because tasks then become so complex that students don't have the time to address them. So there's a bit of a balance here. And this is not just occurring in professional courses, this is occurring everywhere, right across the spectrum. So yes, of course, most professional courses have had many authentic assessment items or tests or examinations or tasks for many, many years. This is permeating everywhere. So, have we solved the problem? Are those recommendations of 10 years ago mostly sorted out? Few little pockets which need to be mopped up? Well, I think the answer is, as you might guess, no. We haven't actually solved all the problems. The first thing that we haven't solved is assessment is not related to learning outcomes. So when you actually map the assessment activities in any course, in any discipline, against what it is that you want students to be able to do, we find enormous gaps. As I mentioned before, massive, massive over-testing of knowledge and technical features of learning, massive underdevelopment of a whole range of other things. And when these external accrediting bodies come in, it's very, very embarrassing for the university. So they say to the business school, you claim to develop the ability of your students to work in teams, where is it being assessed? And they put their hand up and say, oh yeah, in one little place in third year over there. That's it. But the other things that are being assessed, the knowledge and the technical stuff, is everywhere. Another problem with assessment still remains is there's still this obsessive focus on memorization. I'm not wanting to suggest that it is unimportant to memorize things. It is important to memorize some things. But why do we do it? We do it in order to solve real problems. So let's in assessment focus on what the problems are, not on the memorization of facts, independent of important problems. There's also a reliance on too small a range of assessment methods, examinations, tests, essays, and a few other practical things, quite limited. And that's quite a restriction. And the way in which we portray what students have achieved is nothing less than archaic. What does a grade point average actually mean? Nothing. Nothing. It's an average of different measures over different outcomes in different contexts over time, and we include in that average things that students didn't do very well in their first year, but in their final year they know very well indeed and they can do it very well. But we average the whole thing together and we get this nonsense figure called the grade point average. The only people that use grade point averages are graduate schools that somehow have got a naive faith in these things. So how do we portray achievements? So these are the things I want to come on to now in the second part. So, two challenges. How can we complete the move from a standards-based framework for assessment? We've started down that path, but we've still got some way to go. And I mentioned assuring learning and authentic assessment, so we need to do more on that front. But also, I think the other big challenge is to do more through assessment to position students as learners and as producers. So the old way of thinking was students are just consumers of knowledge. Suck it in and regurgitate it in assessment. Society is not going to pay universities to do that anymore. They want graduates that can go out and change things, fix things, operate in the world. And that involves the kind of things we do in the university, means that students are also producers as well as learners. There is some consumption there. So what are the implications of a standards-based approach? What are the implications of that for assessment? The first one, and forgive me if this seems obvious, it is obvious, but it is absolutely not what we do. So the question is, why are we doing these things that are not rational? So we need to think in terms of judging whether students can demonstrate achievement of learning outcomes to a given standard. So there are standards, there are criteria. Do students meet those standards and criteria? And this is the agenda that the OECD has been promoting amongst developed countries for more than 10 years now. So this is now the international norm. And it's important to think about it in terms of this international norm because all of our countries are producing graduates that will be internationally mobile. And we want our graduates to be recognised in other countries. And unless we have some way of demonstrating what standards our students have met in any given discipline, in any given course, they are less likely to be accepted when they move country. And a very important consideration in this judging students against standards is just because a student does very well on one thing doesn't compensate for them doing poorly on another. They must meet the basic minimum standard, otherwise they do not pass. And the old way of assessing means that somebody gets 80% on one item of assessment, they get 20% on the other, or no, 30% on another. You average it out and they pass. That is no longer acceptable. This is a fudge. This is the universities engaging in corrupt behaviour because we're claiming that our students can do something and our assessment system manifestly does not show that they can. So we also need to think about transparent standards for assessment tasks. Setting a pass mark has got nothing whatsoever to do with standards. It's arbitrary. You know it's arbitrary. You've sat in committees in which you fiddled with the pass mark to make it go up and down. Have you fiddled with the pass mark in terms of absolute standards and explicit criteria? That's not what people tend to do. In fact, I've just been at a discussion last week. I was interviewing academics in the Coventry University in the UK, and they have a joint course with Deakin University, where I work, in Australia. And they had a common course. And one of the problems was, well, the pass mark at Coventry is 40%, and the pass mark at Deakin is 50%. What do you do with a common course? Well, it's irrelevant. You just fix it. There's no matter of principle involved in the old way of thinking about assessment. In the new ways of thinking about assessment, we actually must judge that against some kind of standard. And finally, all assessment must be standards-based. And the reason for that is if we use the old way of judging students, that is, we take the students in a particular cohort and judge them against each other, what happens when the cohort changes? The cohort improves, standards go up. The cohort drops, the standards go, no. We have no way of maintaining standards if we are comparing students with each other. So the old way of thinking about norm reference assessment is dead, and we need to bury it. And not only do we need to bury it, we need to put a stake through the heart of norm referenced assessment, because it is not fit for purpose in any world in which we exist. So what do we need in this world? We need meaningful statements of learning outcomes. And my experience in Australia is that the first time people write learning outcomes, it's nonsense. It's there to satisfy a form that someone from the administration has asked them to fill in. So the first iteration doesn't make any sense. The second iteration, which happens probably a year or two later, starts to identify something which makes sense, but it's not really usable, and it's only on the third iteration that learning outcomes have become meaningful. And we need to have meaningful learning outcomes because there's a whole lot of things we can't do very well without them. And this is nothing to do with satisfying the people in positions of responsibility. It's all about us maintaining and developing high quality courses and have our students learn things. So we need clear learning outcomes. We need clarity about what the minimum standard is, not across the whole curriculum, but for every single act of assessment. Every single act of assessment. What is the minimum criteria below which the student will automatically fail? We need to think about that. We also need to think about assessment across the whole student programme, because the other thing that we find when we do research on this is that if we just leave it to the people responsible for each subject, each unit, each module, then things get left out. Things are not assessed that are really important, just get left out because they fall in the gaps. So we need to think at a programme level about assessment and learning outcomes. We also need to replace our legacy assessment record-keeping systems because our record-keeping systems are all geared up for norm-reference testing. Even in universities in Australia that have gone a huge way down the path of having a standards-based approach, you look at the record-keeping system and it records percentage marks and it allows you to average percentage marks in ways that are completely inappropriate. We've got to fix that. This is the task for the next 10 years. We need to think very carefully about how we assure learning outcomes. And I'll say a bit more about that on the next slide. And there's still a bit of work to be done on authentic assessment. So we need to be thinking about learning outcomes because that is the discourse for all that students do. It's very important. I never talk to students about grades and marks. I will only talk to them about meeting learning outcomes. I will talk to them about criteria. Because if we focus on grades or marks, we have lost the debate. Lost it completely. So we need to focus on things that are meaningful, not things that are not meaningful. So we need clarity about the key decision, which is what is the threshold. We need to relate course-wide learning outcomes with unit outcomes. And we need to think about summative assessment as assuring learning outcomes. And there's a bit more of that on the next slide, I think. Yes. So one of the activities that's become very popular in a number of places is the idea of curriculum mapping. So what you do is you look at the learning outcomes for a whole program, you look at the learning outcomes for each element of that program, and then you look at assessment activities. And one of the things you do is you identify what each act of assessment does. Now, is it an introductory level, in which case you might record something and give those marks to students? Is it a developing level standard, which means you've gone to the next level? Is it a mastery standard in which students must complete this? So we're in a faculty of nursing here. So what is a mastery level standard? It's washing your hands before every patient. Right? It's not 50%, it's not 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, it is 100%. If you don't do that, you shouldn't be a nurse. So there are thresholds in some areas, And the most important thing of all is, what is the graduate level assurance? And where does it occur? Now, it might not occur in the subject you're teaching. It might occur somewhere else. So we need to map things, and we need to be clear as academics about what kind of assessment we're engaging in. Are we just helping students along the path, or does assessment in our subject, is it really about assurance? And can we trace all this? Can it be audited? Can an external person come in and see what we're doing? Can we be transparent about it? Okay, so that's the kind of the catch-up work we need to do. And I just want to finish on these three final themes here. And it's about repositioning students as learners and producers. And the three things I want to focus on is developing students' evaluative judgment, that is them judging their own ability, reconceptualizing feedback, and finally commenting on new portrayals of achievement. How can we produce something other than this testama at the end? So the most important thing we need to do has got nothing to do with assessment, but is to shift the conception of students of themselves from the conception, I'm a student here, to I'm a learner. You might think that difference is subtle, but it is quite profound. When students see themselves as learners, their whole relationship to what they're doing there changes. Learners have to be active. Learners have to do things. They do not sit and wait for people to thrust information at them. That means we've got to get much more active students. We've got to organise our curriculum so they're more active. And we also need to be careful about making unilateral decisions about them that they have no role in. So, these three themes. The first one is about developing evaluative judgment, and it's based upon a really, really simple idea. Forget about students for the moment. If I can't judge the quality of my own work, how can I learn effectively? How can I learn what do I do next? And in the workplace, how do I know that the work I'm doing is satisfactory or not? Well, I have to make a judgment about that, and I will take into account all sorts of other considerations. But if I wait for my manager to tell me that it's satisfactory or not, that's too dangerous in the workplace. They might think, this person is not competent. Why did I employ them? Out you go. So we need to think very carefully about how do we help learners make judgments, and indeed help people in work make judgments. So if students can't judge the quality of work, how can they learn effectively? If graduates can't judge the quality of their own work, how can they practice effectively? And if they can't help each other judge the quality of their work, how can they work effectively with each other? So that's the kind of the prompt for us to think about this idea of developing evaluative judgment. And this is how we've defined it: the capability to make informed decisions about the quality of work of oneself and others. I'll give you the example of you need a serious operation and you go to visit a surgeon. Who would you have confidence in? Would you have confidence in the surgeon that says, oh, I think I can do that okay. I've done quite a few of these and most of them have turned out very effectively? Or would you have confidence in the surgeon that says, I've done a limited number of these procedures, but my colleague down the corridor has done 100 of them every year, and his performance on these is spectacularly high. You would actually build confidence in the surgeon that had a realistic appraisal of their own ability. So why do we need a new term? Some people say, well, we have this term called self-assessment. That does the work for us. We've argued that that's not a good term because self-assessment has been positioned too much in the assessment discourse. It's been seen too much as an alternative to other forms of assessment. Students assess themselves instead of being assessed by other people. That's a ridiculous polarity. We need all of those things. What the notion of evaluative judgment does is it puts attention on what graduates need to be capable of, no matter what their course. And it's a goal to be pursued, and it's not somewhere you actually get perfection. You know, I, Gregorio, you, we're all making evaluative judgments of our own work all the time in order that we should do better in the next iteration. So this is something which never ends, but we do need to help students develop this capacity. So, well, you probably also might say, well, we do this anyway. Students pick this up. We don't need to actually have activities to pursue this. Well, I would suggest that we don't do it explicitly, and because we don't do it explicitly, for some students, they don't get it. It's also rarely systematic, which means they might get it in one subject but not in another subject. It also gets fragmented by the curriculum. Different people do different things in different ways, so students don't get a clear message. And many of our existing teaching and learning, and particularly our assessment practices, inhibit it. So the assumption behind most assessment now is that I'm going to assess you. You know nothing. I'm going to be the judge, and my decision is final. Is this a good strategy for developing students' own judgment? Well, I would suggest not, because it is denying them a role in the judgment. They need to find a place in this. So these are two key elements of evaluative judgment: understanding quality and making comparisons. How can anyone produce good work if they've never seen good work? So one of the things we need to think about is how do we actually show students what constitutes good? And not just showing them, but how can they for themselves appreciate what the good qualities are of this work? And these, and I'm not going to go into the details, you can read about this at some other time. These are some of the components of evaluative judgment that we've talked about in that book that I showed you. And I'll say a bit more about some of those when we talk about feedback. So these are some of the things that you would see on an agenda about developing evaluative judgment. How do students discern quality? How do they recognise good work? How do they actually determine what the criteria are for judging whether something is good or not? There's been a fashion to have rubrics everywhere. And I know one of you in the audience is actually doing their PhD on such things. But we need to be very careful that rubrics don't trap students into thinking that somebody else will always provide the criteria for judgment. In most situations in the real world, you have to work out what the appropriate criteria are and then apply them, rather than actually read them on a list. So then you practice in judging against standards and criteria, have considerations of how do they manage their own biases, work out whether they can trust the feedback from other people, how can they seek out opportunities for practice, and what do we put in courses that enable students to do these kind of things. I'm deliberately skipping this over lightly in order to keep the time. Second theme is about feedback. Everyone thinks they know what feedback is. And I've been doing research over the last 5 years or so on feedback, and I am profoundly disturbed. Profoundly disturbed. I'm disturbed to the extent that the things that I've spent most of my academic career doing and calling feedback isn't feedback at all. I was providing students with information that wasn't actually very useful to them. I thought it was very useful, but I don't think it is now. So this is an example of what something is not feedback. I left feedback on their essays which they never collected. All that is a ritual that teachers go through. It makes zero contribution to learning, and it is a complete and utter waste of our time. Totally. There is no redeeming feature in it. It's just busy work. So, if we think about what is feedback, this is the definition that we're currently working with. And it's actually modified over time. The first thing is feedback is not an input. Feedback is not the giving of information. Feedback is a process. There is information involved in the process, but the information itself is not feedback. It's a process in which learners make sense of information. So, of course, they need some information in order to make sense of it. But we need to focus on what the student does, not what we do. It's information about their performance. So this is something that they've really done. It's not something they might have done, not something that hypothetically has occurred. They've actually really done this. So we look at what that is. And they use it. Feedback ain't feedback unless students use information to change, to enhance the quality of their work or their learning. Now, this is the current version of it. And if you want to follow this up, we had a project that's we've got a website about called feedbackforlearning.org. It's where the little cartoons have come from. And you can follow that through. And one of the things we've been interested in doing is doing a study of what really good feedback looks like. And we did a huge study of 2 very large universities in Australia, and we got students to identify what was their very best experiences of feedback. And then we went along and we did case studies of those subjects to see why they thought it was very good. And on our website there, you've got little videos, you've got descriptions, videos of the teachers talking about how they did it and what they did. And we've got 7 case studies there, and we've deliberately chosen them to be studies of demanding situations. So in our context, first year is a very demanding situation. Very large classes are a very demanding situation. So at least 2 of those examples are classes of more than 1,000 students. 1,000 students in first year is not untypical in Australia. Might be here, but for us it's quite normal. So if you can do something for 1,000 or 1,500 students and it's fantastically good, then you can do it with small groups of 100 or so. So one of the things that has come out of that is that we need to stop using the word feedback to describe unsolicited information that is given by teachers to students. That is not feedback. It is one little piece of the feedback process. So we need to call it for what it is, and it's information giving. Information giving is very useful, very important, but it ain't feedback. We also need to think about the role of students in this process. So why is it that we don't normally ask students, when they hand in their work, on the front page, why do we not normally ask them to say, I would particularly like comments on this aspect of my work? Very simple, doesn't involve any more work, but it also shifts the whole discourse of feedback from an information-giving one to a part of a dialogue. Why don't we also expect students to say what they're going to do with this information? Now, they might not end up doing that, but unless they actually started to think about it, the chances of them making a difference later is very small. So we need to think about how other people can be involved in feedback. And one of the things that we discovered in our big survey was a much higher proportion of students than we guessed use family and friends to provide information about their work before they handed it in. Much higher than we were anticipating. And the other important thing of all is about design. Why should we waste our time giving students feedback information at the end of semester? It's a ritual. It doesn't have any direct learning benefit. If we did that earlier on in the semester and we had activities, other tasks that students could do in order to show what difference it made, then that will be a much better use of our time. And the final thing I want to focus on, how are we going for time? I think we're okay. Yep. Is new portrayals of achievement. And this is the kind of the new space. We're starting to do some work in this area, but this is more cutting edge than some of those others. So we've already determined that a final transcript with a list of subjects and grades isn't very useful. We're also getting messages from students that say there are 200 students graduating at the same time from the course I'm enrolled in. When I go out there into the world, I don't want to be shown how similar I am to the other students, the other graduates. I want to show how different I am. So maybe we need to start thinking about assessment for difference. Assessment activities which are deliberately designed to show that this student is different from that student, And we're engaged in certain kinds of innovations about that at the moment. And the other thing is, we've got this simple piece of paper at the moment, which we know doesn't actually communicate anything to people, because we know, we have evidence that employers do not select students that get the best marks. They do not select students in many professions, in many occupations, that got the highest grade point average. Employers say to us, well, we don't want to employ them, they're useless. They can do academic things, but they're not very useful in our business. So this is a clue to us that some of the things we're doing aren't useful. So one of the things that people are starting to play with at the moment is how can students portray their achievements? And how can they portray their achievements through a mix of things which the university has validated, which are the things that we assess, and the things in which they portray themselves. So at the moment we're working on how students can curate portfolios of achievement and present themselves in the world. And we've delightfully discovered a whole new range of theory and conceptual frameworks that might be useful for the ways in which we might do this. And the academic discipline it's coming from is the discipline which you probably haven't heard of, called celebrity studies. There is a discipline called celebrity studies. It's a part of cultural studies. And it's a study of how do celebrities project and promote themselves in the world. Now, we can see through social media people projecting themselves all the time, projecting themselves in which they've got very little to project, but they're fantastically good at projecting themselves. So what can we learn in assessment in higher education from Kim Kardashian, for example? Now, you might not think she is a person that's made a substantive contribution to assessment in higher education. No, you don't think that? Ah, well, I'm disappointed. So the question is, what can we learn not just from her, but from people in that space? Because in the future, or not in the future now, for many of our students, their ability to navigate their way through a varied career which changes is dependent upon how they project and demonstrate what they can do and how they can do it to different audiences for different purposes. So new portrayals of achievement is something which I think we need to be doing a lot more investigation of. I think I've already said that. So what next? So what are your priorities for assessment reform? How will you influence policy and practice in some of these directions? And how will you be able to avoid being a party to counterproductive assessment practices, even when they're completely taken for granted in your own context? So how will you be able to position yourself? So finally, just want to say something that assessment must be deliberately designed to have a continuing positive effect on student learning. If it doesn't do that, it's not fit for purpose. And it needs to prepare students for the future, not just get them to look to the past. In fact, we must be very careful in not trapping students in their past behaviour when they subsequently do much better. We also need to build students' capacity to judge their own work and that of others, because so many of other outcomes are dependent upon that. And we need relentlessly to equip students for the future, not primarily through the specific knowledge and skills they acquire. They're important, I'm not saying they're not important, but through their capacity to make informed decisions about their own work. If we do that, we will have graduates that are fit for society, and maybe we will have graduates that can get jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now is the time to the questions. Preguntas, cuestiones en español, inglés, debate, discussion.
Hello, my name is André. I am from University of Porto. Thank you for your presentation. I think it was very interesting. I would like to ask you, in terms of defining learning outcomes, you think you should differentiate the learning outcomes according to the level of the students, or just find the same learning outcomes to every single student?
That's a very good question. At the moment, we advertise our courses in such a way that students come to us and they study these things, and we say that although there's going to be some variation, they will have achieved certain agreed outcomes, whether we call them outcomes or not. So at the first stage, we need learning outcomes that apply to everyone, and we need to say that if you come to us, these are the things that you will be able to do if you're successful. So there's a level of learning outcomes which is the basic bread and butter, as it were, of what universities do. And for each of those learning outcomes, there will be a threshold which will say, well, you need to have met those learning outcomes above a certain level. Okay. So that's the first part of it. So yes, in terms of our normal discussion of university courses, then we need learning outcomes of that kind. We also need to communicate to students that they're not just here to jump through the hoops that we put in front of them, that they're also here to utilise the resources of the university to pursue their own learning outcomes. Now, these learning outcomes will not be specified by us. They will not be in the documentation that we provide to students. They will be things that students will do on the way through. Now, at the moment, these student learning outcomes are not a legitimate part of the curriculum. They're called extracurricular activities, and they're in a box over there, and we have nothing to do with it. I think one of the things that we will need to look forward to is activities which explicitly recognise students' learning outcomes. One of my PhD students at the moment is doing a study of placements in health sciences. And one of the things that she's found is that when students have a placement is that they do learn the things that are the learning outcomes that we specify, but they learn all sorts of other amazing things, absolutely amazing things, that we couldn't have predicted and they couldn't have predicted until they're in the placement. And at the moment, those things are completely ignored. So we've just written a paper about assessment of work-integrated learning, and it shows how poor assessment is in those contexts. And we need to have assessment which captures the rich learning that people actually experience in those settings. So yes, we need learning outcomes for ourselves, but also learning outcomes for students.
Gracias. Juan. Sí.
This guy knows all about rubrics.
I wanted to know, what do you think about multiple choice test? I mean, maybe it depends on on the discipline, on the way you create them, but in general, what's your opinion?
The first thing to say is that most multiple choice tests in most universities are terrible tests. Not because multiple choice tests are not a good thing, but because they are so badly designed. It actually requires much, much, much more effort to design a multiple choice test than it does to produce a conventional examination. And by and large, we don't put the investment into that. The other problem with multiple choice tests is that because so many of them that students have experienced in their past education have been bad, students have learned this adaptive behaviour. And they see, there's a multiple choice test. I know what the trick is to do well. The trick is to memorise all this information. And I'm sure if I memorise all this stuff, I'll be able to show how good I am in the multiple choice test. And if you've got badly designed multiple choice tests, that works. So students are reinforced in this memorisation behaviour. So it is possible to design really good multiple choice tests. There is a place for multiple choice tests. And if you look on our website with our case studies of excellence in feedback, there is a limited number of multiple choice tests in that group. But to the extent to which they're used now is completely crazy, because multiple choice tests are only good at judging certain learning outcomes. And they're not good at judging others. So yes, there is a place for them in the overall diet of assessment, but it's a much smaller place than they exist at the moment. And we need to do them an awful lot better than we are right now.
Gracias. My question is in Spanish. Mi pregunta es sobre si podríamos hablar de ambientes de evaluación, así como hablamos de ambientes de aprendizaje, la recreación de ese ambiente de aprendizaje en el momento de la evaluación, ya que aprendemos en laboratorios, talleres, prácticas, pero el momento de la evaluación es un test escrito de selección múltiple o es un test de de enfrentarse al profesor en un juicio, ¿verdad? Entonces, ¿qué opinión tiene o qué experiencia tiene sobre la creación de ambientes de aprendizaje, creación de ambientes para la evaluación, o sea, montar un play, como dicen los británicos? O sea, ¿qué experiencia tiene sobre ello?
What's your opinion about?
You might want to put it in there.
Yes, he said that what's your opinion about how to design some kind of environment or climate environment of assessment? Because the assessment is focused on only in a particular context, for example, to take a multiple choice or a brief essay or a laboratory, but we need to create some sense of a more amplified environment to assessment. What's your opinion about this? Okay?
I agree we do need to have a more rich and diverse environment, an ecosystem for assessment. And the starting point is when you have good learning outcomes, and you've been through these cycles to get good learning outcomes, this is the way we judge whether the assessment system is adequate, because we need to say, well, let's say we've got a course with, a subject with 5 learning outcomes. We need to show how the assessment activities enable us to conclude that the students has met those learning outcomes at the appropriate level. And the chances of us being able to do that through a single assessment process is just about 0. Occasionally, very rarely, perhaps, but mostly not at all. So we do need a diversity of assessment practices, even within one unit, within one semester. And the way we judge whether we've got the right mix is we go back and say, these enable us to say that the student can do the kind of things we've said that this unit enables them to do.
Eduardo?
Thank you, Professor Boud. Thank you for your conference. I think it's quite interesting for us. One of the most interesting points for me is the idea that the portrait of achievement is archaic. In what extent the use of standards for assessment is also archaic? And a standard could be used like a point estimation in statistics, not as interval estimation. So, in what extent the use of standards for assessment is also archaic?
There's a word that I didn't pick up there. Could you help me?
No. What?
I didn't fully understand the question.
Bueno, Eduardo, que no entiende la cuestión, no entiende la pregunta.
Okay, sorry, I mix statistical ideas plus one related to assessment.
Yes.
So, in your presentation, one of the sentences, there is a portrait of achievement is archaic.
Archaic, yes.
So, in what extent the use of a standard for assessment is also archaic? So, because teachers usually identify the use of a standard like a pointed estimation, not an interval estimation in statistics, for example.
But I think one of the things we have to do is we have to move from where we are now in the right direction. Now, I don't know how far we can go in some of these directions. So what we have at the moment is we have measures that do not enable us to say what they're measuring. So if somebody, do you have percentages here? Is that common, or are you grades? Yeah. Both? Yeah. So if somebody has an assignment that has 67%, how do we interpret that? What does it mean? What does it signify? How does it relate to any particular standard? So it's from that point of view I'm saying that some of our existing assessment grades and marks are archaic, because they do not enable us to track back and ask the question, what does this mean? And typically we have, say, 3 different measures, and each one the student gets 67%, 70%, 55%. And they're 3 different things, 3 different standards, but we average them as if they were the same. This is statistical nonsense. And we're perpetuating this nonsense all the time. So we do need to disaggregate some of the things that we're doing at the moment. And I think there's a challenge to statisticians here in actually coming up with new measures that appropriately aggregate things which can be aggregated and avoid aggregating things which can't be aggregated. And they also need to have a rethink about the normal curve.
It's a simple question, actually, following from that. I very much agree with, the standards-based assessment, and, I totally agree with this nonsense you're talking about. But do you know any institution that is actually close to delivering, the ideal that you're presenting to us? Because I can't say how I could get that through my own university. But do you know of any cases? Because that would be extremely helpful.
Well, I'm having a battle with my own university as we speak. And partly it's because of the way the records keeping system is set up, that it would require the investment of many millions of dollars for the university to have a record keeping system that would allow the things that I'm describing. So it's not a simple change, because we've got this massive infrastructure, these programs, lots of people invested in this. So the answer is, in general, not in large institutions, but there are a number of small institutions and pockets within those small institutions that are finding ways through. I mean, the typical example is always Alverno College in the US, but that's so untypical that we can't really use that as an example. But some of the things that people are doing in the medical field, in programmatic assessment, the work of people like Kees van der Vleuten at Maastricht University, in the medical school there, are starting to show ways in which Kees is a psychometrician, and he's saying we need to invent whole new ways of doing programmatic assessment in which it is educationally defensible, and works in a medical context in which it is absolutely essential, not that students get good grades. Who cares whether they got good grades? What's really important in a medical context is, can they go out and safely treat us? Can they intervene on our bodies usefully? That's the only criterion ultimately in medicine. So we need to kind of, and he and his colleagues are doing something on this front. How do we make this transition from some of the things we're doing at the moment to other things which are also statistically defensible, which enable a more direct comparison between what assessment says and what is needed by graduates?
Sally?
Buenos días, soy Sally Brown, universidad donde soy profesora visitante, Edge Hill University, is una universidad who are trying to get to that position, the place where I'm a visiting professor, David. We're speaking about it mañana in the afternoon, and come and hear John with a little from me. But my real point, thank you, was to say, David, Assessment 2020 had huge influence worldwide. It had huge influence. People like me and Phil Race and others all used that work to change practice in the UK. I believe it worked because it was a combination of practitioners, pedagogic experts, teachers, but crucially, senior managers. Is it possible, David, to make changes, cambia en universidades, is it possible to change universities without buy-in from the senior managers?
No.
Thank you.
The simple answer is no. The group that we've got to influence are senior managers who, by and large, don't realise there is a problem. Right? It's not as if they're being obstructive. My experience of senior managers is they're very open and willing to listen to these kind of ideas, but they say, well, but nobody's talking to me about these issues. Like, what? There's a problem? Tell me what the problem is. Senior managers are there to fix problems. I mean, we might not think that. We think they're there to get in our way. But in fact, in terms of the dynamic of the institution, they are trying to position the university in a useful way, and they're trying to deal with the problems that come up. So what we're seeing now in the senior managers on the educational side of the university, people, for example, like Deputy Vice-Chancellors Education, we're seeing a much greater sophistication. People like yourself took on roles like this much earlier on, but we're seeing increasing numbers of people that have got some educational sophistication in those roles, and we can then have a sensible dialogue with them. But without them, we can't create the conditions that enable these things to occur. So, for example, I talked about the record-keeping system. The record-keeping system needs at least the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education to be pushing for it and to have the finance person on their side as well. Without that, nothing will change. So these people are vital, and they're also vital in terms of reforming assessment policy. They themselves might not have a particular view, but they are aware that, for example, we need to move from a rules-based policy to a principles-based policy because it gives them less headaches, because they don't have to worry about litigation, which does keep them up at night.
Hello, David. I'm John Bostock from Edge Hill University in the northwest of England. And tonight you've taken me on a really great journey from memories to things about the future and what's going on now. And I just wanted to share with you something, because when you said that most of the content of what was going on tonight is central to curriculum design, I've been involved in helping our nursing department at Edge Hill University as they move into a medical school around their assessment. And what we looked at was, what are you actually doing, or have you been doing, for as long as you can think, under the auspices of misinterpretation, I think, of the NMC, the Nursing Midwifery Council. And we found that the nurses themselves were writing around 38,000 words a year in essays. And about, how was that actually authentic? How was that actually serving a purpose? So I don't think we came up with the idea, but I think we borrowed an idea from America, because they kept talking about conceptual curriculum. And we looked at what it is that we'd like to get from our students, what the students will become, what will they look like, student nurses, what will they look like? And we almost drew a picture of, it's like a pretend nurse and put around it all the things that we'd like to see. And from that derived a number of extremely innovative assessment processes, which, had we stayed with the previous system, would indeed have actually dumbed down the innovations and what have you. And what it did as well is something that you may have a view on this, is that it created authentic assessment opportunities, but it also did away with something that we were worried about, which was to do with another interpretation of authenticity. That is it the students' work? Because when the essays were being produced, though the essays were part of the, or reflection of what they might do or think about in the nursing profession, it could easily be repeated by anyone. You could set that essay and it could be written virtually by anyone. But through this new conceptual curriculum, it became so personalised, or has become so personalised, that each student has a genuine, authentic product, if you like, to give. And that has really seen a change in the way in which their curriculum is viewed. So from that, I just wanted you to, because many of the words you've said tonight were reflected in the deliberations we had. And the person in charge of the programme said, I think now we're preparing our nurses for anything.
Absolutely, that's what we're in the business to do. What you've described is another version of what I described from Case van der Vleuten and the programmatic assessment thing, because that's driven all sorts of innovations in assessment practices and so on. So this is another path to very similar outcome. The interesting thing is about cheating. And my colleagues in the centre that I run have actually got quite a substantial research program on contract cheating. And one of the things they're doing is empirical studies of contract cheating, not conceptual studies, because lots of people have written about them without actually having any evidence of what happens. So they've been collecting examples of, well, they've been purchasing dodgy essays from cheat sites and getting them to be marked to see whether they can be detected or not. That aside, it is often believed and articulated that if you move towards authentic assessment, you minimise the chances of contract cheating. I have to say that is a naive view. It does minimise it, it does lower it, because it makes the challenge of the contract cheating websites more demanding. So I think what's going to happen is they will put their prices up for authentic assessment tasks, because at the moment it is absolutely easy to purchase an essay about anything at any level in any subject area using any marking criteria, because what happens is that you submit what the task is. The student submits to these cheat websites. They say what the task is. They even submit the rubric. They say, I want this level of pass, and the websites will guarantee that level of pass or your money back. I mean, they're very commercial operations. So we need to be mindful in all that we do in assessment of the existence of this new industry. So what it has done is it has basically scared people off from traditional essays because it's so easy to cheat on those. So what we're moving towards is more authentic examples, and also the obsession with impersonation and having examination conditions. Now, I also have to tell you, having examination conditions does not stop cheating. Because what happens is that, you will not believe this, there's a whole lot of people out there that will be prepared to go into an examination and take the examination for you. And they will pretend to be you, and they will use your student card. And the one thing that we've found is that it is very difficult for people that look after examinations to spot, the difference between this. I mean, maybe if it's a woman and it's a man taking the exam, maybe they'll spot that. But other than that, there's a very low chance of it being picked up. So examination conditions do not stop cheating. So we actually need to put an investment in this area, and we do need to move towards authentic assessment. And the more contextualised it is, the better. So what you're doing, if they're writing something from the placement setting that they've just been in, it just makes it harder and harder and harder. So all we can do about cheating is to actually make it hard for the cheats. We can't stamp it out, I'm afraid to say.
Gracias, Sally. Ya nos hemos pasado un poquito de tiempo, pero había una última pregunta, ¿no, Pepe? ¿Tú querías preguntar? ¿Sí? ¿Por aquí? ¿Pasáis el micro? Perdón.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Boud, for your conference. I would like to ask to you, how do you think e-learning innovation introduce new assessment opportunities? And also, is that a challenge for changing assessment methodology? And another question, please. Do you think the new assessment has a relation with the transversal competences, with ethic assessment, with know-how from the students, not just with the subject, but also with other competences? Yes, both questions, please.
Yeah. Can I take the first one, because I understood that one. I'm not sure I've got the second question. But on the first one about e-learning, I come from Deakin University, which is a very interesting institution. Since the day that it was founded, it has been a distance learning university and a face-to-face university simultaneously. So if you teach at Deakin University, you are both teaching face-to-face and fully online. Not blended, fully online, because our students are spread all over Australia. So about a third of our students never come to the institution, and we never see them. Right? You've got to think about that. We never see students for the whole of their degree, in some degrees. In some practical things we do have to see them. What that means is that we are continually challenged on the assessment front to have assessment that works both face-to-face and fully online. And that has opened up new possibilities for us. And it has enabled us to do completely sensible things. So, for example, every student in the university hands in their assignments electronically. We don't have physical assignments anymore. They're all in the cloud. So that has enabled all sorts of possibilities, and it enables things to do with feedback and tracking feedback to be possible, because there's a system which contains the information, the students' work, the feedback, and so on and so forth. So yes, it has driven innovation, but the important thing is, in Australia, we've been teaching at a distance for over 100 years in universities, so this is not new. All that happens is that we now have the internet to help us. You know? When I first went to Australia, I taught my course face-to-face and at a distance. And back then, we had to communicate by the postal service. Right? The distances were so great, we couldn't even have a phone call to the students because the phone call was too expensive. So we can do things which are directly equivalent online and face-to-face, and it be completely transparent. Because at Deakin, students can move through their own choice, unit by unit, going one at a distance, one face-to-face, one on a campus, one remotely, at their own choice. They do not have to decide that in advance. Okay? So what it means is that we've got to have a whole ecosystem of teaching and assessment that works seamlessly. But I don't have the second question.
The second question was about ethic competences, about assessing ethic competences.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that not just Deakin, but a number of Australian universities are doing is that we have these things called generic attributes. And a university might have, I don't know, 6 or 8 of these generic attributes. And they include things like problem solving, working in a team, things to do with cultural diversity, and there's a group of them. And what the university says is that any student that takes any course in the university has to meet these generic outcomes. So what it means is that when we're doing the mapping process, I talk about curriculum mapping, we've also got to map outcomes onto these generic attributes. So we can actually directly track through what are the assessment activities that demonstrate students have met these attributes. So we don't assess them independently of the particular studies that students are doing, but they have to, within those studies, do assessment activities which demonstrate they've met this.
Última pregunta, Pepe. Venga, que nos estamos pasando de tiempo.
Gracias. Pepe Serrano. Hola. Pepe Serrano, de la Universidad de Málaga. Le agradezco la ponencia y la claridad de su exposición. Y yo coincido en plenamente casi todo con lo que se ha expuesto. Y además considero que el feedback es muy importante para el aprendizaje. En el siglo pasado yo daba clases de asignaturas de año completo y teníamos exámenes parciales y me permitía evaluar, corregir los exámenes, devolvérselos a los estudiantes, comentarlos, resolver las dudas, incluso hacer el ejercicio completo. Y esto servía para el aprendizaje, sobre todo para aquellos que no lo habían superado, porque después tenía la recuperación. No había internet ni móviles con cámaras de fotos. En este siglo tenemos internet, tenemos móviles con cámara de fotos, cada vez enviamos esa foto al instante a cualquiera o a cualquier grupo, que todos los estudiantes tienen el grupo de WhatsApp en clase. En aquel entonces eran grupos de 140 estudiantes, ahora tenemos grupos de 60 estudiantes, pero son asignaturas cuatrimestrales. Cuando acabo de hacer el ejercicio, 3 días después empiezan los estudiantes con otra asignatura, con otros profesores. Todavía no lo he corregido. Si vienen a revisar el examen, no vienen a aprender los errores, vienen a ver si yo me he equivocado en la nota. Entonces el feedback lo he perdido. ¿Cómo lo podríamos recuperar? Esa es mi cuestión, no sé si alguien tiene alguna respuesta, porque yo creo que a veces la organización de las cosas nos encorseta en nuestro trabajo y nos impide hacer las cosas como nos gustaría hacer o como se podría hacer mejor. Gracias.
One of the things that's happened in many countries has been the fragmentation of the curriculum. It has been introduced under the heading modularization in order to solve certain problems. By solving some problems, it has created other problems, and it has created one of the problems you've identified, and that is that there's not enough time to have any feedback cycles within however many weeks it is. What it means, though, is that, well, first of all, we might want to push back against modularization. That's a different battle. But what it means we have to do is, within a particular unit, we have to work out how the feedback loops work within it, and how many feedback loops we can fit within that, how many we're involved in, how many might just involve peers. It's a design challenge that we have now. And if we are in that situation, we've got to change what we do. And the problem I see all the time in feedback is that feedback is the last decision we ever make. We make all the other decisions about the curriculum, assessment, etc., everything. And then we think, oh, well, we just had a bit of feedback in. And if we leave it till then, it's too late. So we need to think about building feedback loops in much earlier. And in the case that you've described, having feedback at the end is worthless. So you've got to stop doing it and move it earlier, because otherwise you're not using your time in the most effective way.
Thank you. Gracias a todos. No sé si hay desde organización algún tipo de... Sí, pues Rocío nos tiene que dar algunos avisos de organización. Muchas gracias, David.
Buenas tardes. Me gustaría informar a los congresistas que vayan a exponer en los talleres de las salas 31, 32 y 33 que a lo largo de todo el congreso, si pudiese ser, estuviesen 10 minutos antes de empezar la sesión para grabar las presentaciones correspondientes en el ordenador, ¿vale? Gracias.